So this morning, I'm going to introduce this idea of abortion and coercion. The ideas behind it share some testimonies of women who have had an experience of coercion in an abortion decision, and just look at the issue more generally from a campaigning perspective. And then Dr. Greg Pike will be able to go a bit more specifically into some of the research. I'll touch on it a little bit, but I'm going to look at it more from both a campaigning perspective and from the perspective of women who I've spoken to in my work as services coordinator with SPUC. So a common mantra of abortion campaigners is "my body, my choice." They even refer to themselves as pro-choice. However, I have often found this narrative of choice to be a hollow one, and one that's not backed up by the lived experiences of many women. So today I want to explore this with you and to call into question these ideas of choice and autonomy in the decision to have an abortion. So like Michael said, Her Voice is an SPUC initiative which aims to give women a platform to share their stories of having been hurt by abortion. I've had the opportunity to speak with many women who have had abortions and that have profoundly regretted them. And in doing so, I've begun to see a pattern in their experiences. So these are all taken from Her Voice testimonies. These women say things like, "It wasn't my choice. My choice for abortion wasn't really a choice at all. I was only offered one choice. I believed I had no other choice. I felt I had no choice." Most of the women who have shared with us felt as though they had no choice other than abortion, but the reasons why they felt this way varied. So why do women feel as if they have no options? The research shows that women, even women who are considering abortion, rarely see their unborn child as a threat. In fact, they tend to think of their child positively. Instead, it's the external circumstances that lead them to see abortion as their only legitimate choice. These circumstances can include relationship problems, pressure from those around them, ongoing domestic violence, a desire to continue studies, career aspirations, financial difficulties, or a general lack of community or family support. I saw this the other day. This isn't actually mine. A pro-life influencer actually came up with this, but I actually think it's a very helpful matrix to consider the kinds of things that are influencing a woman's decision to have an abortion and where she is at the point of that decision. So the two axes on this matrix are voluntary to coerced and uninformed to informed. And you can think of sort of an abortion decision, of course there are external influences, but in many ways an abortion decision can sit somewhere on this matrix. And I think we can think of women who are at the extremes of each of these situations, right? So a woman who is far at the end here, doesn't know anything about the humanity of the unborn child, doesn't know what the procedure entails, hasn't been given all of this information, and somebody is actively forcing her to have an abortion. And at the other end, you have the "my body, my choice," empowered, informed decision, right? Those are the sort of extremes that we might look at on this matrix. But in reality, a lot of these decisions exist elsewhere in the middle of this matrix, right? So people's information about the procedure, about the nature of the unborn child, all of that will differ. And the influences on them will have varying influence on their ultimate decision. So I think it's kind of helpful to consider it in this context. In the midst of what can already be a very fraught decision, many women are under a significant amount of pressure by those around them to have an abortion. And the research meets this out. I know Dr. Pike will get into more of this, but most recently, just earlier this year, I believe in February or March, a general population poll on reproductive coercion was carried out, commissioned by the BBC. And it found some pretty striking things. It found that 15% of women aged 18 to 44, childbearing age, had experienced pressure to have an abortion that they did not want. Now that is not 15% of women who had had abortions. That's 15% of all the women polled. That is a very striking number. In that same group, 5% had experienced violence with the intention to force a miscarriage or end a pregnancy. And 3% had experienced someone giving them a substance or a drug to cause an abortion without their knowledge or consent. Those are very striking statistics when you're considering the general population of women. So who are the perpetrators? Coercion and pressure can come from a variety of sources. It can come from a partner who doesn't want a child, or a parent who doesn't think that their daughter is responsible enough to have a child of her own. Shockingly, it can come directly from medical staff, particularly in cases where a child has been diagnosed with a disability in the womb. I'll talk a little bit about that more later. In those cases, abortion's often presented as a humane choice. Employers or academic staff can often make women feel irresponsible for pregnancy and can complain and make it very difficult to accommodate pregnancy and maternity in the workplace or in a school environment. And this can mean that they inadvertently push women in the direction of abortion. Coercion can be intentional and blatant. I've spoken with women who have had abortion appointments booked for them without their consent by a family member. But more often, that pressure and coercion can be a lot more subtle. After receiving a prenatal diagnosis of disability, it's sadly common for women to feel pressured into having an abortion by doctors or healthcare staff. Common experiences include being told that their child was incompatible with life, would live a life of suffering, would be a vegetable, that is not my choice of word, or would ruin their family. Some doctors still seem to have misinformed views about disability and may have negative and judgmental attitudes towards couples who wish to continue a pregnancy. As a consequence, they fail to provide the necessary support to parents who are receiving what is very difficult news. This is particularly egregious when you consider the fact that the evidence shows that when an abortion is undertaken for reasons of fetal abnormality, the after effects can be particularly traumatic for women. So, what can coercion and pressure look like? These are things that I know some women have heard, the words I've put together just to give you an idea of some of the things that people might be hearing when they find themselves pregnant and facing a difficult circumstance. They'll hear things like, he says he'll leave me if I don't have an abortion. My mom will kick me out if she finds out I'm pregnant. He said, I can't even look after myself. How am I supposed to look after a child? My boss said, I don't think we could survive another employee taking maternity. The doctor said my baby would have no quality of life. My baby will suffer the same violence that I do. The nurse said I only have a couple weeks left to decide. So when we've done some of our own surveying of women who have had very negative experiences of abortion and have experienced significant regret, one of the things they say across the board is that they felt rushed. And that's very common in abortion decisions. So often you'll have, it gets harder as you go further along and there are time limits and this and that. And women feel as though they have to make the decision right this minute in the moment. And that can have a huge influence on the decision they end up making. So this idea of feeling rushed has a huge influence. He says he'll hurt me if I don't have an abortion. So like I said, the pressure on women can be subtle, like overhearing a boss complaining about women taking maternity leave, or it can be much more overt, like a partner threatening violence if they don't have an abortion. In addition, like I said, many women feel rushed in the decision to have an abortion, and this can be exacerbated by those around them, particularly including healthcare staff. One thing that many don't consider is how pressure and coercion impact on a woman's informed consent. According to the NHS, for consent to be valid, it must be voluntary and informed, and the person consenting must have the capacity to make the decision. In this sense, and this is from the NHS, voluntary means that the decision to either consent or not to consent to treatment must be made by the person and must not be influenced by pressure from medical staff, friends, or family. Therefore, women who have been coerced into having an abortion have not given proper informed consent for the procedure and should never have undergone it. It's the duty of abortion providers in obtaining consent to ensure that women are free from external influence on their decision. In my experience, in speaking with women, they have continually neglected to do this, and in this way have seriously failed those women. So I think it's worth noting and talking a little bit about the pills by post scheme and how this influences, basically how this interplays with this idea of coercion. So for those of you who don't know, pills by post was brought in as an emergency measure during the pandemic to allow for women to have telemedicine phone calls with doctors and then have abortion drugs sent to their home and they undergo the procedure at home. Following the pandemic, the decision was made to make this permanent. So this is normal practice. And the current pills by post scheme leaves women particularly vulnerable to coercion in the process of their abortion. Now, I know many of you will have written to MPs and partaken in a lot of this, so you'll know some of these points, and hopefully you made them in the letters and emails that you sent forward to your MPs. But it's worth noting, especially in the context of this talk. So in the pills by post scheme, where again, a woman's just having a telephone call with a doctor in a lot of cases, and again, from women I've spoken to, you're talking about maybe a 10 to 15 minute phone call. In that time, she's denied the opportunity to speak to healthcare staff alone, away from those who might be putting pressure on her. So this is something that should happen in a clinical setting, right? The person who's consenting should be taken away from any external influences and asked privately. But there's no way to guarantee this over a phone call, right? There's no way to make sure that her partner isn't sitting across the table from her. So her abuser or abusers may be present for and in control of every step of a pills by post abortion, from the phone call to her actually taking the pills. And at no point is she provided a safe space to alert others to the abuse that she's suffering. A poll of GPs found that over 80% of GPs were concerned that the pills by post scheme would leave women vulnerable to this kind of abuse. So this is just something to keep in mind, because this is regular practice here in the UK now. So I want to tell you about Hayley. Hayley, I tell her story with her permission. Some of you might have heard her speak at the March for Life this year. She's become very outspoken, particularly talking about abortion and coercion, and she's very graciously worked with me a little bit about how to tell her story to more people and get it out there. She's actually coming to our Glasgow conference next week. So Hayley had grown up in a cycle of abuse. At just 15, she met her partner, Scott, that's not his real name, who was 22. Scott was incredibly abusive towards her, but based on her previous experience, she didn't know any better, so she didn't recognize the abuse. At 16, Hayley discovered she was pregnant. As a result, she was kicked out of where she was staying. Scott demanded that she have an abortion, and even went as far as to try and run her over with his car. So here are some quotes from Hayley about her experience. She says, "It was a very abusive relationship, but I didn't know any different after my childhood. It felt like he was all I had. So I went along with everything he asked of me, like an obedient puppy. I found out that I was pregnant when I had just turned 16. Of course, Scott didn't want to hear about it. He demanded that I have an abortion. I spoke to my uncle. He called me many hurtful names and threw me out. The abuse started again. He would go between sweet nothings and trying to run me over with his car. I really wanted my baby, but in that moment, I felt like I needed him more. He kept telling me it was just cells anyway. It wouldn't feel anything or know anything about it. When the time was right, we could have more children." Hayley went on to have an abortion. At the clinic, Hayley told the counselor that she didn't want to speak with her, because if she did, she would change her mind. Hearing this, the counselor was still happy to send Hayley on for an abortion. Hayley illustrated many red flags at the abortion clinic, and no one asked her if she felt forced to have the abortion, or even if she wanted it. So here are some more quotes from Haley about that day. "A counselor had to see me. I told her that I couldn't speak to her because if I did, I would change my mind. She sent me back to the waiting room. I was crying so hard, the nurse was stroking my hair and saying it will all be okay. The last thing I said before I went to sleep was, 'No, it won't. Nothing will ever be okay again.'" As I said, Haley was deeply affected by her abortion for many years until she was able to find healing. Now she wants to make sure that women like her are protected from the kind of abuse that she suffered. I would encourage you to read Haley's full story on the Her Voice website. It's also on our coercion website, which I'll point to later. It's deeply moving, and you hear more about what that whole experience was like for her and what her experience of healing was. So the main point that I'm getting at through all of this is that coerced abortion is abuse, and it's a type of abuse that often goes unrecognized. The legal and medical community must recognize this reality and work to protect women from it. They have a duty of care to the women who are coming through. So if it hasn't become clear, if you're on our mailing list or the theme of today's conference, coercion and abortion is going to be one of our primary campaigning points in coming months. It's something that we're really focusing on and trying to look at the ways that we can spread awareness about the issue and also put in place protections for women. One aspect of this campaign is the public awareness campaign. So we haven't really done anything quite like this before, and I would definitely encourage you all to get involved. The idea of this campaign is that we're wanting to draw people's attention to this issue so that more people are informed and so that our legislators can recognize it as an issue and act on it. So we'll hear a little bit more about this idea of messaging in John's talk later. But we also want to reach women who are at risk of coerced abortion and direct them to help, right? So how they recognize it in themselves. There's a screening tool that was developed by Arch that they can use, but how they can recognize it in themselves and get help before it's too late. So as part of this public awareness campaign, we've developed a series of materials with the idea that they're easily distributed in places that you go every day. So obviously, as a pro-life campaigning organization, we can reach our lists and we can reach our members, and that's wonderful. But there's a whole group of the population that we're not able to reach the same way with this message. But we all go out in the world and we all interact with people. And so we ask that you bring these materials with you and meet people where they are with this messaging. So we have posters that you can put up in church halls, in chaplaincies, in pharmacies, in community centers. We have small business-sized cards that you can leave behind you in the loo or leave in your seat on a train, or all of those places that you go every day. We have coasters that you can bring with you to a restaurant or a pub and leave on the table behind you. We have stickers that you can put on your notebooks or on your laptops or on bulletin boards. And this is all with the hope of reaching those people that are usually out of our reach, reaching those people who are at risk and reaching those people who have never been exposed to this as an idea before. So we have some of those at the back. Please take them with you. Take all of them with you. We need to get them all out there. Don't worry about taking them all from us. We can always order more. And that's actually where I'm going to leave you this morning. I'll leave some space for questions because I actually moved through that fairly quickly. And then again, Dr. Greg Pike is going to take over after we've had tea and coffee, and he'll be able to get into more of the specifics of the research. So if you have any questions about that, I'm certain some of them will be answered later on. So, I certainly hope that this is something that you're all interested in, and hopefully, yes, please get involved with the campaign. Thanks very much.